Welcome back to another JJ in the Field, timely agronomic tips when you need them most. I'm Jonah Johnson. Today I have with me our PCT product technical specialist to the south, AJ Krupp, and to my right, your left, we have our PCT Sunrise research agronomist, Brian Reed. So if you'd followed our videos back in the summer, we talked a lot about tar spot, and so if you haven't experienced tar spot on your farm, unfortunately you're probably going to, if not this year, in coming years for sure, because this is obviously a very taxing corn disease, and the northern Ohio has been dealing with this for probably going on 4 years, going into its 5th year now. So it's a disease that needs to be recognized and identified on your farm if you've not already. And so the question's been posed, from traditional fungicide methodologies, applying it VT or perhaps earlier, or a combination of the two, and hoping that fungicide application would be enough for the growing season. But what we're finding with tar spot, being that it can come in late, after a fungicide residual may have extinguished and ramp up to a level that may warrant another fungicide application. Now, universities, third-party research, they're looking at this very question still. But for us as a PCT team, we had an interest and we had the availability this past growing season in 2023 to look at that very question, is if we have bad tar spot incidence and severity, can we come in late? In a lot of cases, this may not fit your operation, but for us, we had the opportunity to work with a UAV company, aka drone, to apply fungicide late. So when we say traditional application timing of the VT application, a lot of times, again, going back to my initial comments, when that's the one and done, and the airplanes leave the air and move on to their next jobs across the country, it may be a challenge to get them back. With the UAV, aka drone, we have more nimbleness to get those guys in and make applications. So AJ on his farm was gracious enough to let us look at this very question. So we had two questions essentially. Number one, what happens if we have late season tar spot past the VT application, it comes back? And in 2023, we did, and it ramped up. And for some of us, we may have had clean corn up through R2, R3 growth stage, in that reproductive growth stage of corn. And then it came in very late as the late August and September rains had warranted conditions to stir up the tar spot incidence and severity. So traditionally, when you look at university research, it would state that past R4, so that's before we get to the dent stage of kernel set on that ear, they would say that you would see no positive return in regards to a fungicide application. But that's in the absence of tar spot. That goes back to just looking at traditional corn diseases such as northern corn leaf blight and gray leaf spot, eye spot, and others. So when tar spot comes in late after the residual is extinguished, is there a benefit of using, and that's kind of where this question is taking us. And the trials that Brian and AJ did this past summer looked at that question, past R4. So in the incidents on AJ's farm here, he had a cornfield that we looked at this question and said, if we come in past R4, was there a benefit to that? And so AJ, why don't you tell us about your farm, the field, what was applied, and what did that turn out for us here?
Thanks, Jonah. So if we remember back to the summer we had in 2023, on my farm, we applied a kind of what you would call a tier 3 fungicide, a 3 mode of action fungicide at the VT-R1 timing. In that application, we also had some foliar nutrition as well. So if we remember back to the summer, there in July, we started to get pretty dry towards the end. And then as we got into August, at least in western Miami County, we started to pick up ample rainfall to the tune of 4 or 5 inches in the month of August. So as I'm out scouting my fields with my dad, one field in particular, we started to look at and started to see a severe incidence of tar spot in that field. So that's when I got a hold of you guys, thought, hey, is there something we can try and look at to see if we can answer that question? Would it pay late? So essentially we had a 60-acre farm that, had, like I'd mentioned, already had one application of a tier 3 fungicide on it.
And what was the timing of that?
So that would have been at R1, which would have been roughly July 28th, I believe, is when that got applied.
And how was the crop disease, like what was disease pressure? Because if I remember correctly, this was kind of your standard methodology for your farm, right? That you had planned fungicide passes probably before that time, right? That was just part of your management on your farms. And what was things looking like back then?
Correct. On our farm, we always tend to plan for a VT R1, depending on when the helicopter can get there. At that timing, disease severity was fairly low. I mean, there was some gray leaf spot in the lower canopy, but you really had to hunt to find northern corn or even tar spot. It was pretty much non-existent at the time of application there at the end of July.
Okay. So we had this discussion, so we went back and at what point did you rescout your field and say, well, I got a problem here, and this is obviously kind of how this trial developed. And if you followed our videos from the summer, and we'll repost those links for you to follow if you're caught up, and they're all the short videos, but we showed the progression of this. So do you want to walk us through kind of when was the alarm trip for you after that fungicide probably was extinguished on your field?
So roughly 3 weeks, and like I mentioned, we had a very conducive environment in August for disease severity to really spread. So roughly 3 weeks after that July application, I got back out in the fields, started walking them, and once I got to this field, my eyes were kind of opened at how severe and how quickly this tar spot had got out of control, honestly.
So when we walked these fields, I walked along with AJ and Brian. We went out there where you'll see where we looked at leaves, and the guys laid out leaves, and you could see quite a difference at that time where we had pictures from early on and at this time frame. And then we'll take it a step further and you'll see some graphics of what that second fungicide application looked like. So we got a hold of a UAV company, the AKA Drone again, in AJ's neighborhood. They came out, and what did we look at for that application, for the second application?
So to kind of set up the trial, the field was planted east to west. We decided to apply north to south. We thought that would give us a definitive line if there was going to be a difference between the one pass versus the two pass program. So getting with Brian, getting with Jonah here, we decided to apply 7 ounces of Veltima. We put our PCT Zephyr 2 in there to help get that fungicide stuck to the plant. And then, as we talked, we all three decided to add some late season foliar nutrition as well to kind of see, hey, can we pick up extra bushels even at R4, R5 with a fungicide, and then with additional foliar nutrition as well.
So you're probably asking yourself questions right now. Oh, wait a minute. We just had 2 tier 3, if you will, class 3 fungicides, meaning that they're the newest, latest, and greatest versus some of the older chemistries that's been around for a while. So these would be, what was your product again, application 1?
Application 1 would have been Miravis Neo.
So Miravis Neo is a newer product. And if you just heard AJ say, our second application was BASF's Veltima, which is another tier 3, newest, latest, and greatest, extended residual products that are some of the best in their class right now. And you may be saying, boy, that's, did that pay for itself, being that those are probably a bigger investment with those type of fungicides? And so we looked at that for the question because, number one, we had the product availability to us at the time. There may be some other avenues that we can use, some maybe older chemistries at that late application timing, because where was your crop at that time of our second application? What growth stage would you say on that year? Where were we at?
So we were full R4, if not starting to get into the dent stage, the R5 stage there. So it was progressing very rapidly up to the 3rd week of August. When we got to the 3rd week of August, if we remember, temperatures started to cool back down. So that was part of the question we all thought to ourselves too, as we looked at normal R5, maybe 20, 30 days in length. This year when we looked at R5, I think we were more in the 40, 45 days even in some cases. So there was a lot of time left on the table to help influence yield, we thought. So that's why, essentially we decided to pull the trigger on doing this second application.
So if you remember, normally we'd say fungicides from third-party research like through universities would state at R4, that dough stage, before we get into that essential dent stage of corn, that you would not see a return on investment. And that may have been very much true for traditional corn diseases, but to AJ's point, as these corn diseases, tar spot comes in late and it's a very aggressive disease. When we have extended windows of grain fill like we did this year, traditional R5 maybe 30 days, but because of the cool temperatures like AJ mentioned, it was a long window, and there was a lot on the table to be lost. And the reason we felt this way, because the last several years, we've had growers say they applied fungicides at traditional time, the crop was clean, and they came back real late. They were just checking their fields, looking at ears, looking at what they may have to harvest, and looked at total degradation of plants and thought, what did I just leave on the table because I didn't see that this disease came in so badly? So that's where all this whole research had kind of spurred from. We're very interested in, because the industry as a whole has kind of been dragging their feet on this very question because they don't know whether or not another application is going to pay right now. So that's why we looked at this, and that's why we wanted to share the final results of this trial. Again, if you followed us through the growing season on this. So some of the things we noticed, and you'll see some graphics show up, we saw where leaf quality had degraded. So the guys went out and pulled leaves from the single application and then the double application, and there was very clear evidence that that fungicide did help overall plant health. Cobs, that we looked at ear fill, grain fill, they were very squishy, and just were probably going to be very challenging at harvest to thresh that grain off there. Ears from the second fungicide application, it was a night and day difference. And so that brought up a lot of ideas that this is something we need to continue to do in the future to have a handle on this, because it may not be for everybody, it may not be every single year, but we saw that this will bring value potentially here in the very future. So as we talk about, I use a lot of analogies, and we talk about building the bank of our corn plants. And so as we transition now, we'll talk with Brian about what did the results come from, what did the data look like. And if you remember AJ alluding to that, he said, we're interested in feeding that ear leaf, what can we bring to late season nutrition? So to set the stage of why we have interest in this, several things to think about. So if, everybody's wanting to increase their plateau and their yields on their farm, they're wanting to break that barrier, increase their yields in corn and beans. And so how do you do that? Well, it's not a simple answer, but in theory, the way we look at this is that when you start off strong, this is not something you can plant, spray, put on early season, ABC, what have you type of over-the-top products, and then check back in at the end of the season and see what you got. You have to be looking, scouting through the growing season. If we're having ample rain events through the summer, keep feeding that crop, keeping your foot on the throttle, because if you do not feed it, you're not going to break those plateaus like you're striving for. So it's not every single year these type of programs are going to work, but we got to be in the mindset to have more passes through that growing season instead of a one and done and see it harvest. And so when I talk about building that bank, we're looking at storing nutrients, getting big stalks, big leaves, and that's analogous to the hybrid per se. And it's going to vary in how that looks. But the point is the bank is at the end of the growing season. When we get to R2, for example, brown silk, that plant starts shutting down roots, and it can no longer take in specifically nitrogen from the soil. So at that point, we're starting to rely on the bank, what's in reserves in the stalks, in those big leaves, to retranslocate and fill those developing kernels in that ear. And that becomes very important. And so as we talk about late season nutrition, when we have our throttle down through the growing season, that ear leaf sticks out directly onto that growing ear is analogous to directly that source sink of energy into that developing ear. So what can we do to feed that? So if we're going to go over for another pass, like we just talked about tar spot, we're going over what can we do to keep that plant growing and actively growing through the rest of the growing season to give that late season punch, the last bit of fuel, so to speak, to win that race and be very successful. So now as we turn to Brian, tell us a little bit about what is in number one, our PCT foliar. And we just laid out multiple passes that you did in this trial this year with AJ. So we had single application of fungicide, we had 2 applications of fungicide, and then on top of that we had our PCT foliar, a new product. So why don't you walk us through what's in PCT foliar, and then what did some of the data look like from those applications?
Thank you, Jonah. So, like they alluded to, we're trying to, continue that crop on, continue to feed that ear leaf, and what are some of the things that we can do to influence that. So, if you look at nutrient demand curves on what that corn crop is needing at that stage in its life when it's trying to fill those kernels, and what it's reallocating from its bank, as Jonah mentioned, we always think nitrogen, boron, zinc, things like that, those key micronutrients. So that's exactly what we've built into this aerial foliar product. So we have boron in there, we have zinc, we have our sugar shot, so we get a full load of sugar. We like that for its humectant properties to get that nutrition down in there and to get it stuck to the plant. And then we also have nitrogen, and those are key ingredients that help feed that ear leaf late in the season to then help pack those kernels, fill those starches, gain your test weight, and then continue driving that yield and continue to maintain that yield that you were all after originally.
Is that an easy addition into the spray tank for either an airplane, helicopter, or drone?
Yes, it's a very easy application to make. It's a 1 gallon use rate. We can apply it in UAVs, drones like Jonah mentioned, airplanes, helicopters. If you have your own applicators, you can run it through that as well. It's very easy to mix as well with things like Jonah and AJ had alluded to. We've mixed it with various fungicides, and it goes in well, and it's a great product and performs very well, as we'll see here in this trial when we show this data to you. With the single fungicide application, we were at about 216 bushel corn dry, and that's really good, and there's no fault to that. But when we came back and made that second application to continue that plant health and extend that plant, through the rest of its life cycle, we were up to 224 bushels when we just compared two applications, a single application to two applications. So when we made that comparison, we picked up roughly 7 bushels. And we break that apart even a little bit further, like Jonah and AJ had mentioned, when we stuck our aerial foliar in there to continue to feed that ear leaf late in the season, when we looked at the second application of fungicide and then incorporated our aerial foliar into that, we picked up an additional 8 bushels with just our aerial foliar product. So that really opened our eyes to, there is a lot of late season nutrition that these plants demand and that we can, provide to them in a timely manner and then continue to enhance and protect their yields ultimately.
So Brian alluded to a moment ago about that late season nutrition, and research out of the University of Illinois, Fred Belo's research showed the partitioning data, and I talk a lot about this through the winter meetings, where that data shows where all the nutrients go in that plant late and what that plant uptakes. And so when you look at that brace at the end of the season, that's where we've learned, to Brian's point, boron, zinc, nitrogen, those late season nutrients are very important in that plant. It uptakes a lot. So we position some of that early, but late season now we're aware of what's necessary to reach that next tier in our yield potential. So how many years have we looked at this now, Brian, and what's this trial look like going into 2024?
Yeah, so this is our second full season. We looked at it, in 2022 and then again here in 2023. Primarily looking at aerial applications, with the UAVs and the drones. So we've got 2 years of data on this across multiple farms, multiple different counties and locations throughout Ohio. Some of them were, split blocks like this. Some of them were, replicated strips across the field. So we have a pretty wide and diverse data set for this aerial foliar product. And right now we're at just over 6 bushel average advantage on yield when we apply this product between that VT, R1, and all the way up and through R4 like we did here in this trial that we talked about today.
So the burning question now, I'm sure on your minds is did this pay with all these applications and all these a la carte ingredients on there? And so if you think about the grain markets, they're not the best right now, but Brian, what did that look like in the fall time in just rough math? Would this have paid this year? And keep in mind, we were using tier 3 fungicides, and do we need to use a tier 3 late in the season? I think the answer, and then we're gonna look at that very question this year of using older fungicides as a triazole based fungicide that's a very nominal input increase, and to see if we can alter that when we might not necessarily need that strobilurin portion of the chemistry, and of course that extended residual, because obviously we're coming to the end of the growing season. So how does that look like for 24, do you think? Let's back up and say, did it pay for this growing season?
Yeah, so if we think back to fall and what corn prices were then, $4.50, just under $5. A bushel. This trial, when you sort of combine everything together and looked at 2 fungicide applications with the nutrition, we were really close and probably just a slight ROI there. And you have to break it down to, the fungicide that we did use, like Jonah mentioned, and what we were doing. That sort of drives some of that cost. But, corn prices influence that too, obviously, as well. But, we did show probably a slight positive ROI, and it all depends on how you market your grain and, what your ultimate, price bushel is. But, the original intent and the design was that, we need to build this data set and sort of figure this out, because there's going to be years, like Jonah mentioned, where, corn prices will be better, but the disease severity may not be as well, or it may inverse and the disease severity may be really bad where the corn price isn't so good, but we can pick up a significant amount of bushels by continuing to protect this crop. And those are the questions we're trying to answer we're trying to figure out what we can do with that corn crop towards the end of the season. So we'll continue in 2024. We'll evaluate. We'll redo this same trial to the best of our abilities given the growing conditions and seasons, and we'll continue to evaluate aerial foliar as well for another year and get that out on some more acres.
So we're going to look at this with a cheaper input, like I said, late in the season on this application to see if we can encourage that ROI to be better. And then you also may be asking, hey, I have clearance machinery that I can get over that crop, and we're working on a product for going over the top as well and use at higher use rates when you're using higher carrier volumes, let's say with a high clearance machine sprayer. So for more on that, feel free to follow us on pctnutrients.com. I'm Jonah, he's Brian, this is AJ. Thanks for watching.